The mid to late 1990s was certainly one of the most transformative times in video gaming history since the 1983 video game crash. It was the time when Nintendo started to lose its place in the industry as the ultimate top dog, faced with tougher competition, criticism of their practices, and third parties having issues with their more recent consoles. The Nintendo 64, once seen as the next big thing that could easily fight its competitors with stronger hardware, faced severe criticism for its hardware design and, most importantly, the continued support of cartridges. Nintendo's decision to keep cartridges came down to stronger performance and faster load times, compared to slow speeds and load times of the CDs, but developers were not pleased with this. On top of the difficulties of working with the Nintendo 64's hardware, which is a story for another day, many of them yearned for the CDs, as it would have allowed for them to make bigger and more impressive games thanks to the CD's colossal 600 to 700 megabytes of storage, compared to the N64's 32 megabytes of storage at its most without the expansion pack, which wasn't even an option at the time. These factors, along with the lower costs of using CDs compared to cartridges, were what led to Nintendo losing a lot of support at the time, with many developers opting to go for the Sega Saturn and the Sony PlayStation, the latter being a rival of Nintendo's own making, another story for another time. However, Nintendo had one trick up its sleeve to try and keep its third-party support, even if this trick didn't really involve CDs. It was intended to be a happy middle ground between the speed of the cartridges and the data of the CDs, and was supposed to be the 64-bit version of the Famicom disk system. But fate would ultimately have different plans for this thing. Today on Beta Quest, we will talk about the fascinating history of the Nintendo 64 disk drive. The Nintendo 64DD was conceptualized and developed side by side with the base Nintendo 64, back when it was codenamed Project Reality in 1994. At the time, Nintendo was very much aware of the growing popularity of CDs and their advantages over cartridges, having wanted to make a CD add-on for the Super Nintendo. Again, another story for another day. But there were main problems with CDs that made them not want to adopt the format. For one, as mentioned before, CDs had very slow load times with standard disk drives at the time, and although a faster disk drive was possible and present, it would have been prohibitively expensive to produce and for consumers to purchase as well. The other problem was that due to the slow speeds of CDs as well as all the moving parts that are required for a CD-based console, the actual speed of gameplay would have been negatively impacted, resulting in games that would have had to be much slower than the games on cartridges. It was hoped that these loading problems and all that stuff would sort themselves out relatively quickly, but unfortunately, that just didn't happen. So it was decided that Nintendo's next projects would not use any CDs. However, the company understood that developers wanted the bigger storage spaces of CDs, and Nintendo would explore alternative media devices that could give big storage spaces while also granting developers a similar speed to cartridges. It was ultimately decided that while the main system would use cartridges like its previous gaming efforts, there would be a separate add-on that would make use of magnetic discs that could hold 64 megabytes, a considerable step up from the main console's 32 megabyte max limit at the time. And I don't think even 32 megabytes was an option for a while, but I don't know. It was also decided that this device would also feature online capabilities, as developers wanted to explore the possibilities of this newfangled internet stuff, and see if it could be combined with gaming, as well as realize Nintendo President Hiroshi Yamauchi's vision of a bunch of consoles across the nation of Japan being networked together. Initially, Nintendo wanted to partner with Netscape, due to their founding members coming directly from Silicon Graphics Incorporated, who designed the main console's hardware, and the intention was to use them to take full advantage of the online sector for their games, including online game mechanics that would be later seen in the 7th generation. However, plans would radically change during the system's overly extended development, with Nintendo opting to partner with Japanese media company Recruit to form the N64DD exclusive Randnet service. Not sure why, as I couldn't really find why this happened, but okay then. The Nintendo 64 disk drive would be formally announced in 1995 during Nintendo's Shoshinkai software exhibition, now called Space World. Well, until Nintendo stopped doing Space Worlds. Although the system would not be publicly shown off that year, it was said that the device was to be launched by the end of 1996, a couple of months after the Nintendo 64's intended and already delayed launch of mid-1996. However, the main hope was that the device would help keep third parties attracted to Nintendo, despite the criticisms and mass exodus they were facing. And to some extent, the system would have succeeded, as they managed to hold on to Enix and Capcom's support. But we'll return to this later. Going on to 1996, and the system would make its first public showing in 1996's Shoshinkai exhibition, showing off the device, its capabilities, and some games that were in development for it. At the time, it was announced that there were at least 100 planned games for the system, including a new entry in the Mother/Earthbound series, a new Kirby game, third-party exclusive Dragon Quest VII, and the intended killer app for the system, The Legend of Zelda 64. The N64DD was showcased as a technically impressive console, as it was capable of many things, such as rewritable data that could allow for a game to transform and evolve, internal clocks for real-time mechanics, image editing for customizable content, and various other impressive features. The N64DD was pretty much excitement in a box. This was an exciting thing. This was stuff that was never seen before. But this excitement would not last, and the system would begin to experience trouble, even before it would even release. During Shoshinkai 1996, it was announced that the N64DD would be delayed from 1996 to 1997, reported by Nintendo as due to protracted development of producing the add-on and the magnetic discs. This was to be the first of many delays that would scar the add-on's image permanently and negatively affect its reputation. 1997 rolls around and Nintendo is unable to show off the N64DD, lacking even a prototype to show off to the public. Somehow. It was also delayed to 1998 as well. At the time, 20 games were announced to be in active and confirmed development for the N64DD, including Mario 64 2, a new Pokemon game, Mario 3 still being in development, and SimCity 64. However, it was also announced that the 1998 delay was because Nintendo wanted for there to be enough games to be launched with the system and have a healthy stream of games as well. But there was a problem. While some developers bought into the magnetic discs of the N64DD, it wasn't enough to prevent the continuous mass exodus towards Sega and PlayStation. The problem was that the N64DD, although it featured more storage than the main system's cartridges, were still not big enough for the projects third parties wanted to have. Third-party developers wanted the CDs because they could make mammoth games with cinematics, music that was far higher in quality than the chiptune stuff of the old days, big stories of epic quests and all of that, among many more features. All this stuff was simply impossible to cram into the small 64 megabyte storage of the 64DD's magnetic discs without making the game prohibitively expensive to produce and sell, along with concerns over the desired huge games being unwieldy for consumers as well. Not only that, but the continual delays for the system were causing developers to lose faith in this project, with any remaining Japanese third parties finally leaving Nintendo to release their games on Sega and Sony systems instead. Well, there were a couple of small-time third parties, but all the big guys left Nintendo. Even Nintendo was losing faith in this project, as many of the first-party exclusives on the 64 disk drive would be officially moved over to the base Nintendo 64 around this time as well, including the intended killer app Zelda 64, now being reduced in scale and redeveloped as Ocarina of Time on the base N64. Nintendo tried to save face by announcing all the companies that were still supporting the N64DD, like Rare, Konami, and Titus, including how they will use the system to expand their cartridge games. But this didn't really do anything to fix the system's reputation that was already sinking. 1998 rolls around and still no N64DD, with another delay for 1999. And it was around this time that things were looking very bleak for the system, as aside from more games being pushed off or cancelled, the system's public reception was pretty much dead. It was like, oh yeah, the N64DD. Does anyone even remember that thing existed? What even happened to it? Oh, it's still alive? That's surprising. What games are there? Oh, there's practically nothing exciting. However, there was one last glimmer of hope for the system's eventual 1999 release. The system's remaining killer app, the heavily anticipated Mother 3, aka Earthbound 64. If this game launches on the N64DD, the wait would be fully worth it. 1999 rolls around and still no N64DD. Well, maybe later this year. But man, I can't wait to play Mother 3 on this thing. Oh. Never mind then. Yeah, okay. But, I mean, maybe that Ocarina of Time sequel, that would be exciting. Oh, it's an N64 game now. Never mind then. Again. And not only were these games removed from the 64DD's lineup, but plans for any Western release were officially cancelled, even though the West was the N64's biggest market. So, yeah, okay. So yeah, the N64DD's continuous delays pretty much killed the console's reputation before it could even launch, along with any remaining third-party and even most of its first-party support with it, even though it had such an exciting introduction to the world. You may wonder, how could Nintendo just keep letting this happen? It's their own console, right? Can't they just release it regardless? Well, there was one central factor as to why all this was happening. And it's going to surprise you. The N64 was bombing in Japan. Yeah, even I was surprised at this. Nintendo was waiting for the N64 to sell at least 5 million units in Japan to have a comfortable install base to sell the N64DD, a strategy that they have used for all their previous add-ons, like the Famicom Disk System, as their previous console efforts were dominating the industry in Japan. However, the loss of third-party support and lack of appealing games resulted in the system failing to compete against the PlayStation and even Sega Saturn in Japan, which was further negatively impacted by the system's increased association with unappealing Western-style gaming, due to more Western third-party exclusives that appealed more to Western gamers than Japanese ones. On top of this, when talking about the cancellation of the Western release, Howard Lincoln, the chairman of Nintendo of America at the time, stated that low demand for the system as well as a lack of compelling software were the central factors to the cancellation of the N64DD's Western release, along with citing the Sega 32X's failure and negative impact on Sega's reputation as additional factors. So yeah, all the cards were pretty much stacked against the N64DD. But Nintendo still had to launch this product somehow. So, they pressed on. The system would finally launch in December of 1999, as the N64 would finally gain the 5 million in Japan required to have a comfortable install base for the N64DD in that year. However, it was quietly released as a mail-order exclusive in Japan only, even though the West was the bigger market, as I mentioned before, because it sold substantially well over there. But whatever. Although later in the system's life, it will be available on store shelves along with its games, so that's cool. Anyway, those who wanted to get the N64DD would have to subscribe to Randnet, the aforementioned internet service that Nintendo made with that Japanese company. What was it again? Recruit? Yeah, Recruit. So you had to subscribe to Randnet and order the Randnet Starter Kit, which would include 6 games bi-monthly via mail order, plus a year of internet service. There were 2 versions of this starter kit, being a version for those who only want an N64DD with a Randnet service plan of 2,500 yen, and a Lisa-owned version for those who want the 64DD and a special translucent version of the N64, with a service plan of 3,300 yen, both of which would decrease to 1,500 yen after the first year. These plans will be changed later on to 30,000 yen for a year of Randnet for the N64DD only version, and 39,600 yen per year for the lease-to-own version. The 64DD was a very impressive piece of hardware that connected to that bottom port of the system that eluded many gamers in the West, as it was pretty much never used. Yeah, the 64DD was what that bottom port was supposed to be used for. The hardware featured many mechanics that would become commonplace in modern gaming consoles, such as real-time clocks, rewritable features, and internet connectivity, even if these features were somewhat limited technologically speaking. The system also featured enhanced font and audio hardware, intended to save space and development time for games released on the N64 and DD, as well as a 32-bit coprocessor that would help it read disk and transfer content between it and the base system. The system also featured a boot menu as well, which allows for the system to start up without a cartridge in the base N64, although thankfully the N64DD ran off the N64's power, so no additional power cord was needed for the thing. Which, makes a lot of sense, as this is an add-on and not some parasite console like the Sega CD or 32X, or most other add-ons for any console release which used a separate power cord. As mentioned before, the N64DD used magnetic discs that held more data than the N64's cartridges and were faster than CDs, but were slower than cartridges and could only hold a tenth of the memory of a CD. The intention for the N64DD's massive storage space was to allow for bigger games to be developed, far exceeding what could be done on a base N64, as well as for games to feature more advanced mechanics thanks to the system's hardware abilities. Many N64 games were also developed to detect a disk drive as well, as it was also planned that base N64 games would be expanded with expansion packs released on the N64DD. To work the N64DD, players not only needed to plug the device under the N64, but they also needed to insert the RAM expansion pack into the main console. Players were also given a keyboard and mouse as well as an audio-visual capture port. There was also a software modem cartridge that was developed for the system as well, developed in collaboration with Nexus Telocation Systems and Surf Communications. A decision made because plans to incorporate this tech into the actual system didn't go anywhere, for some reason. Moving off of that, the Randnet service that existed inside the N64DD allowed gamers to use the internet with a member-only portal and allowed them to share user-made content, email each other, chat, read Nintendo newsletters, and use its features with certain games. And that was about it. Unfortunately, the service didn't really last long for anything of major significance to come from this, although it was planned for the system to make use of online capabilities that will be later seen in modern gaming, such as online competitive play, a good few years before Xbox Live would do this. Only one game will be released with this functionality, being Japan Pro Golf Tour 64, and that was about it. Which stinks, because could you imagine playing games like GoldenEye 007 with this feature? Nintendo would have been Xbox Live before that thing even existed, as I mentioned. But, oh well. It was also planned to use the online service to allow users to play Famicom games, listen to music via early access, watch other gamers play games, basically an early version of Twitch, and engage in public beta testing, an early form of early access. Yeah, Nintendo had major plans for Randnet, many of which will be done in later years by other companies, for better or worse. They were ahead of the curve with this one. Too bad it never really went anywhere. But the most important thing to any console are the games, to which there were only 9 games for the system, sadly. Although these games will be released on store shelves later in the system's life, the main way these games were distributed was through Randnet's bi-monthly mail order service, as mentioned before. Of the 9 games, the system's most famous games are the Mario Artist games, the 4 ones being Paint Studio, Talent Studio, Communication Kit, and Polygon Studio, a successor to the SNES classic Mario Paint, to which gamers could develop content and share them with other users to enjoy. It was actually planned for Mario Artist to be used as part of the system's rewritable data features, as players would use Mario Artist to create content that could be put into other games, such as Mario 3/Earthbound 64, where players could create their own characters and use them as the main characters' designs. However, these features would wind up unused, as no game was released on the N64 or DD systems that truly made use of these features, although the idea would be simplified and revisited with the Mii concept for Wii, Wii U, and Nintendo Switch. Aside from that, we have Doshin the Giant and its expansion pack, where players play as a god, Doshin, who can shape the land around them and help or hinder the world and its inhabitants, affecting Doshin's reputation with fair worshippers. The expansion pack focused on a child who must help free Doshin by watching short featurettes collectively titled More Than Giant, while also engaging in various other additional activities, such as growing Doshin to free him and building monuments in the base game and using the kid followers to free Doshin by giving them love, and they use that to free Doshin? I don't really know, as the whole concept is very confusing and hard to understand. Maybe that's just the American in me and I don't really understand Japanese culture that well, I don't know. But despite my confusion, the base game seems to have been a very well received game, while the expansion seems to have been very heavily criticized. Thankfully, the game will be released on GameCube so people could actually play this thing, but it was sadly not released in North America. It seems like Europe got it though, which is interesting. Aside from that, we have SimCity 64, which is like a full 3D version of SimCity 2000, but slightly simplified with the removal of water buildings, for some reason. Although it would feature new concepts, such as viewing your city at night, individual pedestrians and road vehicles, and the ability to explore your city at ground level. SimCity 64 also incorporates elements from SimCopter, a flight simulator which was supposed to be developed on the system as a separate project, but became integrated into SimCity 64 instead. Although the game was never ported onto other consoles, some of the features of SimCity 64 would find their ways into later entries of the series. There was also the F-Zero expansion pack, which expanded the N64 classic F-Zero X with 12 more courses, a machine creator, a course editor that can store 100 tracks, and new stereophonic soundtracks, along with the ability to create your own cups. The course editor was cited as the expansion's strongest feature, and excited many gamers to see similar expansions. But alas, no more expansions were made, aside from Doshin, as I mentioned before. Although the idea of expanded games would be adopted with the practice of DLC, for better or worse, and of course customizable gaming content would become popular in the years to come, thanks to games like Mario Maker and Little Big Planet. We also have Japan Pro Golf Tour, which is a golfing game. That's about it. Although it does feature a leaderboard function and the online competitive play I already mentioned. The only game to have this feature. And that's it. Those were the 9 games, which includes expansions, released for the N64DD. There was also the Randnet disc thing, which was the dial-up utility disc, but unless you're a very strange person who thinks that's fun to play with, that's not a game. Unfortunately, this was only 9 of 60 announced for the system, with intentions to have many more released after, including Mother 3, aka Earthbound 64, Banjo-Kazooie 2, Mario 64 2, Zelda 64, Zelda Gaiden, Kirby 64, Donkey Kong 64, and many more. Wait, did I say many more released after? I meant this was supposed to be released earlier, and then there would have been a lot of games, but it didn't happen. So, okay. But, moving on from that weird thing I just did. These games I mentioned, they were either cancelled or moved onto the base N64 or ported onto the GameCube due to developers wanting their games to be sold and played by the consumer, obviously. It sucks, honestly, as it seemed like the N64DD would have made these games something else, but I guess not. So, what happens to this system? Okay, let's not beat around the bush. This console died. It died before it even began because everything was stacked against it. It was launched so late in the system's lifespan. It was a mail-order exclusive. It was the third party. It was gone. There were practically no games on this system. Just, you name it. This system had it, and it was killed because of it. And yeah, it was just a complete disaster. Because of all that, it only sold like 15,000 units, which is really embarrassing. Which also meant that there were 15,000 Randnet subscribers. Aside from that disastrous sales thing, reception was mixed, as it was seen as a decent piece of hardware with impressive features, but the minimal number of games made this thing not really worth bothering with. Although the games themselves were rated pretty decently, especially the F-Zero expansion pack. However, despite all this, the system was pretty much rendered irrelevant by the time it was launched, as the Sega Dreamcast would come out around the same time and would do many of the features done in the N64DD a lot better to some extent, and the PlayStation 2 was just around the corner and exciting the mass public with its super awesomeness. Even the N64 would render DD irrelevant, as not only were later cartridges able to store that 64 megabytes of data, but many games were incorporating the system's features into the cartridges themselves via software versions of the hardware's features. On top of this, the Randnet service would bomb hard because of the failure of the system, and it would be shut down in February of 2001, with players having free internet access from October of 2000 until then. The partnership would enter liquidation from mid-2001 until January of 2002. It was a tragedy, an ugly tragedy for this impressive piece of hardware. But if you want any consolation, is that how you pronounce it? Consolation? If you want any consolation over this, Nintendo acknowledged that the N64DD would inspire many of the features found in later Nintendo consoles, such as real-time clocks, digital distribution, player-created content, online gaming, and many more. And it was also just a commonplace feature in many consoles eventually. If anything, everything the Nintendo 64DD did would be widely adopted by the entire gaming industry. Shoot, why did I say that? Yeah, it was adopted by the entire gaming industry in some fashion as additional planned features, like watching other players play their games live, which would be done by Twitch and YouTube and all that, and the aforementioned expansions and public beta testing being turned into DLC and early access, again for better or worse. The N64DD may have been a colossal failure, but it was an important console in Nintendo and gaming's history regardless, due to these factors. And even then, it's a cool thing to have if you have an N64. It's a very sought after piece of hardware, and it's not a terrible console, just a failed console. One with few games. But if you're a gaming historian, it's nice to have one. But that was the N64DD. This thing promised so much to us, and everything about it seemed very exciting to everyone. But the N64's own failure, in a way, in Japan, pretty much killed any chance the 64DD could have had with the public. But it didn't mean that the N64DD was meaningless in the grand scheme of things. For if there was any console that could very well be described as ahead of its time, it would be this device. The N64DD predicted many things that would become staples in the gaming industry, from DLC and early access to game content creation and game streaming. We may not have realized it at the time, but Nintendo was on the very cutting edge of gaming with this weird device. If only the N64 did better in Japan. Darn. Anyway, this is K-Steel Beta Quest signing out. I will see you all later. This was a Kobalt Steel video by MS Bernie. Like, comment, and subscribe if you liked what you saw. Until next time, see you all later.